Hello, my name is Anita Juzova, and this is my video summary for the theme How to build the CPU. There will be three main points I shall look at. First, and the most important point, will be about how CPUs are created, what techniques are used, and how exactly it happens. Then, we shall follow to the second point, microprocessor work, and the word microprocessor is sometimes used as another name for the CPU. And then I will explain how one can compare CPUs until the conclusion. So, to begin with, what is the most important element in a CPU? It is silicon. And silicon is obtained from silicon dioxide, that is abundant in sand. Then silicon is purified, because it has to be made in a pure silicon crystal ingot. And if it will have other element atoms or empty spaces in the crystal, it will affect all the further crystal layers. The equipment that is used has a huge influence on ingot size, and the bigger the monocrystal ingot, the bigger will be the wafers cut from it, and the more CPUs could be made on the wafer, and thus would be less the cost. It is said that every 5 or 10 years the cost of making a new company that could make CPUs double. And that is because existing companies increase the wafer size and they make new technologies. And so they can make more and cheaper CPUs. And that's why new companies will find it hard to compare to them, or even start business. So, once ingots are cut into wafers with a tiny diamond-tipped saw, then wafers are polished and the base is made. The next step includes tiny transistor making. The wafer spins and photoresist is poured on it. The spinning makes it spread evenly. Then UV light is shown through a mask and lens, making the photoresist chemically react with the light. Then a chemical solvent is poured and it dissolves the soluble material. Afterwards, the etching chemical is used, and it is used to dissolve silicon dioxide on the surface. And then the remainder of photoresist is removed, washing it away. Next, to make the needed structure and add small copper wires correctly, additional photoresist can be added, exposed to the UV light, and washed off. Then electroplating can be used to deposit copper ions on the surface from a copper sulfate solution. Also, ion implantation can be used. Additional layer adding, washing, photoresists, and chemical reactions happen before the final product is made. It is said that Intel uses 6 layers of this process, so it's repeated 6 times. And it may take up to 3 months to make a CPU so far, not including testing, slicing, and packaging. All those layers are needed to make pathways for electron currents at high speeds. There are thousands of CPUs being made on a single wafer, well, or at least hundreds, and they all need a lot of layers. Once all the layers and circuits are made, it is time for testing. All the pieces on the wafer are tested, and each result about voltage readings and cascade sequences is saved to a database. Later, the data on the database is consulted, and only those pieces that fit the requirements are cut from the wafer. Then the binning happens. After the voltage, frequency, performance, heat generation, and other internal operational characteristics of its cache are all measured. Manufacturers are constantly looking how to improve CPUs. For example, they try to increase highest-end clock rates. Now let's move to the second theme, how microprocessors work. A microprocessor is also known as a CPU, or Central Processing Unit. It is a complete computation engine that is fabricated on a single chip. The first microprocessor was the Intel 4004, introduced in 1971. First microprocessor wasn't very powerful. All it could do was add and subtract, and it only could do that with 4 bits at a time. So, microprocessors can be compared by the year that the processor was first introduced, by the number of transistors on the chip, by the width in microns of the smallest wire on the chip. For comparison, a human hair is about 100 microns thick, but microprocessors' smallest wires can be even a fraction of a micron. Then microprocessors can be compared by the clock speed, and that is the maximum rate that the chip can be clocked at. Data width is the width of the ALU. In an 8-bit ALU, it can subtract and add and multiply 8-bit numbers, while in 32 bits it can add and multiply 32-bit windows, 32-bit numbers, and in 64 bits it can multiply up 64-bit number. So a microprocessor has ALU, arithmetic logical unit, and it also has an address bus that sends an address to memory. It has data that can send data to memory or receive data from it. It has a read and write line to tell the memory what it wants to get or to get addressed. It has a clock line that lets a clock pulse sequence, and it has a reset line that can reset the clock. The number of transistors available has a huge effect on the performance of a processor. With more transistors, much more powerful multipliers capable of single cycle speeds become possible. Also, multiple transistors allow a technology called pipelining. A pipelining means that several executions can overlap. So, for example, it may take 5 clock cycles to execute each instruction, but there can be 5 threads, and so it will be executed 5 times faster. Now on to CPU specifications. One of the main factors to consider when picking the best CPU for a computer is how the computer will be used. A computer that will be used for general office programs and casual internet surfing or other basic applications will have different needs than a computer that will be used for video and photo editing, graphical design, or video games. So the first features to compare are the brand, and there are 2 choices, Intel or AMD. Then the processor type, mobile, desktop, or server. Then of course the cores. Core indicates how big the performance will be. Back a few years ago, Intel and AMD would raise the performance of their CPUs, raising the frequency. But eventually they both hit a speed wall. So what did they do? Intel decided to take 2 of their CPU cores and put it on a single chip, and AMD soon followed. So, another most important factor in performance for today's CPUs is the frequency. It represents the speed at which the processor runs. And video games are very dependent on the frequency. Next, threading. Multiple threads increase the performance. Also, cache. Cache is embedded memory that holds regularly used information. The purpose of cache is to ensure a smooth and fast transition of data that is transferred from the hardware to the CPU, and cache runs at the same speed as the CPU. Cache is really quick onboard memory, much faster than RAM. Also, they can be compared by chip speeds. 32-bit and that is referred to 32-bit or 64-bit processor. And the thermal power design. It is a general measurement that indicates how much power in watts your processor will consume in the worst-case scenario. In conclusion, CPUs can hardly be made by someone alone in a garage. They need equipment, people who strive to improve it, and hard work. CPU is a lot of technology in a piece of sandpile. CPU can be compared to other CPUs, and one of the most important things is its frequency and cores. Thank you for